Tonight's story was sent to me by someone who asked to remain anonymous. As always, names and locations have been changed. Whether you believe it is entirely up to you. When Daniel Mercer accepted the overnight security job at the Meridian building, he expected exactly what most people would expect from a job like that. Long hours, quiet nights, and very little happening. Honestly, that was exactly what he wanted. The Meridian building had been empty for almost 8 months. It was once a busy office building, filled with hundreds of employees every day. But after the company moved into a newer location across town, the building was slowly abandoned. The lights were turned off, the offices were cleared, the desks were left behind, and eventually the building was scheduled for demolition. Daniel's job was simple. He was there to make sure nobody entered the building before that happened. Every night he arrived just before midnight. He would check the entrances, walk through each floor, make sure the doors were locked, then return to the security room and watch the cameras until his shift ended at 6 a.m. There were 24 cameras throughout the building. They covered the entrances, stairwells, hallways, and empty offices. Most nights, they showed exactly what Daniel expected. Nothing. Just empty rooms, dark corridors, and the occasional flicker from an old light. The building did make noises, but Daniel never worried about them. Old buildings always do. Pipes would creak, the air conditioning would turn on, the walls would shift slightly as the temperature changed. Daniel had worked night shifts before. He knew what happened when you sat alone in a quiet place for too long. Your brain started creating things that weren't there. A normal sound became footsteps. A shadow became movement. A harmless noise became something much worse. At least, that's what he believed, until his 3rd week working at the Meridian building. It happened at exactly 3:13 in the morning. Daniel remembered the time because he was sitting at the security desk, waiting for his coffee to finish brewing. The cameras were displayed across several monitors in front of him. Usually he barely paid attention to them. There was never anything to see. But that night, one of the screens caught his eye. Camera 6, the 4th floor hallway. At first, Daniel thought the screen had glitched. The image flickered slightly. Then he noticed something, a figure, standing at the far end of the hallway. Daniel immediately assumed someone had broken into the building. It was the only explanation that made sense. He stood up, grabbed his flashlight, and checked the camera again. The figure was still there, completely motionless, facing away from the camera. Daniel picked up the security radio. Hello? Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. So he left the security room and headed upstairs. When Daniel reached the 4th floor, everything looked normal. The hallway from the camera was exactly where it should have been. The same walls, the same doors, the same empty offices. But there was nobody there. No footsteps, no open doors, no sign that anyone had entered. Daniel searched the entire floor before returning downstairs. At that point, he started looking for a logical explanation. Maybe someone had broken in and escaped before he arrived. Maybe the camera had recorded an old clip. Maybe there was some kind of technical issue. Anything was possible. Before ending his shift, Daniel decided to rewind the footage from camera 6, and that's when he noticed something that made him uncomfortable. The figure had never walked into the hallway. It was already there, standing at the end of the corridor. The camera hadn't captured someone arriving. It had simply started recording after they appeared. Daniel watched the footage several more times, trying to find an explanation, trying to convince himself it was nothing. But every time he watched it, the same question remained. How does someone appear on a camera without ever being seen entering the building? Daniel didn't tell anyone about what he'd seen. There wasn't much point. If he'd called his supervisor and said he'd spotted someone on one of the cameras, only to admit the building was empty when he checked, he'd probably be laughed at, or worse. They'd assume he wasn't taking the job seriously. So he kept it to himself. He deleted nothing, changed nothing. He simply returned the following night and waited. By the time the clock reached 3 o'clock in the morning, Daniel found himself watching camera 6 more than any of the others. He told himself he was only trying to prove it had been a technical fault, a corrupted recording, a frozen frame, anything that made sense. At exactly 3:13 a.m., The monitor flickered. His stomach tightened. The hallway appeared exactly as it had the night before, dark, empty, silent. Then, someone walked into frame, not from a doorway, not from around a corner. They simply appeared at the far end of the corridor and began walking. Slowly, calmly, almost casually. Daniel didn't move. He stared at the screen, waiting for the figure to disappear, but instead, it kept walking. Every movement felt deliberate, never too fast, never too slow, just one steady step after another. He switched to camera 5, nothing, camera 7, nothing, then camera 8. The figure was there, walking through another hallway. Daniel frowned. That wasn't possible. To reach camera 8 from camera 6 would take at least a minute. The footage showed only a few seconds had passed. He quickly checked the timestamps. Every camera displayed the exact same time, 3:13 a.m. The figure wasn't moving through the building. It was somehow appearing wherever the next camera happened to be. Daniel rushed upstairs again. This time he searched every floor. He checked every office, every emergency stairwell, every storage room. He even unlocked maintenance cupboards that hadn't been opened in months. Nothing. The building was completely empty. When he returned to the security room, the figure had vanished. The footage ended as suddenly as it had begun. The following night, it happened again. 3:13. Camera 6, the same hallway, the same slow walk. By the end of the week, Daniel had stopped calling it a glitch. Instead, he created a folder on the security computer. He named it Camera 6 Incidents. Every recording went into that folder. Every single one started at exactly the same time. Every single one lasted just under 2 minutes. And every single recording ended before the figure reached the end of the hallway. It was almost as if, whatever it was, didn't want to be seen leaving. Daniel started noticing small details. The figure always wore dark clothing. Its posture never changed, its head remained slightly lowered, and despite watching the recordings dozens of times, he could never make out its face. The image wasn't blurry, the cameras weren't faulty. It simply felt impossible to focus on, like his eyes refused to settle on it. One night, curiosity got the better of him. Daniel paused the recording. He zoomed in, frame by frame, nothing. The closer he looked, the less human the figure seemed. Not because it looked unnatural, but because it looked familiar, as though he'd seen it somewhere before, and simply couldn't remember where. That was the moment Daniel stopped thinking about intruders. Because intruders leave footprints, they force doors open, they trigger alarms, they leave evidence behind. This left nothing, except footage. And the unsettling feeling that every night at exactly 3:13, something was walking through a building that should have been completely empty. By the beginning of his 4th week, Daniel wasn't watching the cameras because it was his job anymore. He was watching them because he needed to understand what he was seeing. Every night, the figure appeared. Every night at exactly 3:13. Never earlier, never later. Always for less than 2 minutes. Always disappearing before reaching the end of the corridor. Daniel had stopped trying to explain it. Instead, he started asking questions. The building's caretaker was an older man named Peter. He'd worked there for years, long before the offices were emptied. One quiet night, while Peter was checking equipment in the basement, Daniel casually asked if anything unusual had ever happened in the building. Peter laughed. "You're working nights, aren't you?" Daniel smiled politely. "I've just noticed a few strange things." Peter's smile faded. "You don't spend much time looking at camera 6. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" The old caretaker shrugged. "Nothing." Then he picked up his toolbox and walked away. The conversation stayed with Daniel all night. The following evening, he arrived early. Instead of sitting at the security desk, he went straight into the building's records room. Most of the filing cabinets had already been emptied. Old maintenance reports, fire inspections, renovation plans. Dust covered almost everything. Hours passed before he found a box labeled Security Archives. Inside were logbooks dating back more than a decade. Most entries were exactly what you'd expect. Doors locked, alarm checks completed, routine patrols, nothing unusual. Until one notebook stopped him. The final pages had been written by another overnight guard. His name was Michael Hayes. At first, Michael's notes sounded almost identical to Daniel's. Quiet shift, no incidents, building secure. Then, over several nights, the entries began changing. March 8th. Camera 6 showed movement, found nothing. March 9th. Checked recordings again. Same figure, same hallway. March 10th. Supervisor says it's a faulty camera. Requested replacement. March 11th. Replacement camera installed. Figure still appears. Daniel felt a chill run through him. He turned the page. March 12th. I know someone else will read this eventually. If you are, don't trust what the cameras are showing you. It wants you to keep watching. Daniel sat frozen. The handwriting changed after that. It became rushed, messy, almost difficult to read. The final entry was dated March 13th. There was no shift summary, no patrol notes, just one paragraph. Tonight the cameras stopped following it. Tonight they started following me. Daniel stared at the page for several seconds. The room suddenly felt much quieter than before. He checked the date on his phone. It wasn't March, not even close. So why had Michael's final entry been written at exactly 3:13 a.m.? That detail hadn't been recorded in the notebook. It had been stamped automatically by the old security system. Daniel looked through the remaining paperwork. Tucked inside the back cover was a folded floor plan of the building. He unfolded it carefully across the desk. At first glance, everything looked normal. Reception, offices, meeting rooms, storage. Then he noticed something. The current security room wasn't on the original plans. Instead, there was another room, hidden behind the wall where Daniel now spent every night watching the cameras. Its label simply read, Observation Room. There was no record explaining why it had been sealed. No renovation report, no demolition order. Just a room that officially no longer existed. For the first time since taking the job, Daniel considered quitting. Not because he believed in ghosts, not because of Michael's notebook, but because every answer he found only seemed to create another question. And somewhere deep down, he had the growing feeling that whoever Michael Hayes had been writing to had finally found its next reader. Daniel didn't sleep much that day. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured Michael Hayes' final journal entry. Tonight, the cameras stopped following it. Tonight, they started following me. He told himself he wasn't afraid. He was curious. There had to be an explanation. There always was. That evening, he arrived almost an hour early. He checked every entrance, locked every fire exit, walked every floor. He even placed small strips of masking tape across several doors. If anyone entered the building, the tape would tear. If anyone opened a door, he'd know. By midnight, everything was secure. The building was empty, just as it always had been. Daniel made himself another coffee and sat in front of the monitors. The minutes crawled by, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. His eyes barely left camera 6. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the screen flickered, once, twice. Then the hallway appeared, empty. Daniel waited. Nothing happened. 10 seconds passed, then 20. For the first time in weeks, the figure didn't appear. Daniel let out a slow breath. He actually laughed to himself. Maybe that was it. Maybe whatever had caused the recordings had finally stopped. Maybe he'd built the whole thing into something much bigger than it really was. He reached for his coffee. Then every monitor in the security room went black. Not off, just black. The cameras hadn't lost power. The timestamp was still counting. 3:13:41, 3:13:42, 3:13:43. Then, every screen returned at once. Every camera in the building was displaying the exact same image. Camera 6, the 4th floor hallway. Daniel slowly stood. 24 monitors, one hallway, the same view, the same silence. Then, someone stepped into frame. The figure wasn't walking this time. It simply stood there, perfectly still, facing the camera. Daniel leaned closer. For the first time, it lifted its head. He still couldn't make out a face. The image wasn't blurred. It was almost as if the camera refused to focus on it. Then something changed. The figure raised one arm, slowly, deliberately, and pointed. Not at the camera, past it, as if it were pointing, at someone standing behind the lens. Daniel felt every hair on the back of his neck stand up, because he suddenly remembered something. Camera 6 wasn't mounted at the end of the hallway. It was mounted above the entrance, looking back toward the corridor. Whatever the figure was pointing at would be standing directly beneath the camera. Without thinking, Daniel grabbed his flashlight and ran upstairs. The 4th floor was silent. His footsteps echoed through the empty offices. He reached the hallway. From camera 6, nothing. No figure, no movement, no sound. Just the long corridor disappearing into darkness. Then he noticed something, a faint light spilling across the floor, coming from the wall at the very end of the hallway. The wall where the original floor plans had marked observation room. The doorway was open. It hadn't been opened before. Daniel was certain of that. Dust covered the floor around it, except for a single trail of fresh footprints leading inside. He followed them. One careful step at a time, his flashlight swept across the room, an old wooden desk, broken computer monitors, rotting filing cabinets, a security chair facing a wall of dark screens. The room smelled stale, like the air hadn't moved in years. Then his flashlight landed on the desk. There was a VHS tape, fresh, clean, as though someone had placed it there only moments earlier. A handwritten label was stuck to the front. It contained just one word, footage, and underneath, written in the same hurried handwriting Daniel had seen in Michael Hayes' journal, were 4 words that made his blood run cold. Watch the last minute. Daniel stood motionless, staring at the VHS tape in his hands. For several seconds, he considered leaving it where it was, walking away, pretending he'd never found the observation room, but curiosity had carried him this far. He needed to know what was on it. Back in the security office, Daniel found an old VHS player tucked away beneath one of the storage cabinets. It was covered in dust. Surprisingly, it still worked. He slid the tape inside. The screen filled with static. A loud crackle echoed through the room. Then, the picture appeared. The timestamp in the corner read, March 13th, 12 years earlier. The camera overlooked the old observation room. Daniel immediately recognized it. The desk, the monitors, the chair. Everything was exactly as he'd just found it. For nearly a minute, nothing happened. The room sat empty, silent. Then the door opened. Someone walked inside. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. The person crossed the room, sat down at the desk, and began watching the security monitors. His mouth went dry. The man on the tape was him. Not someone who looked similar, not someone wearing the same clothes. It was Daniel. The same face, the same jacket, the same watch on his left wrist, even the small scar above his eyebrow. Every detail was identical. Daniel froze. He couldn't breathe. The timestamp clearly read 12 years before he'd ever set foot inside the Meridian building. Then the man on the tape slowly looked up. Not at the monitors, not around the room, straight into the camera, as if he knew someone would eventually be watching. For several long seconds, he didn't move. Then, without breaking eye contact, he picked up a pen, pulled a notebook toward him, and began writing. Daniel's heart sank, because he recognized the notebook. It was Michael Hayes' journal, the same journal he'd found in the archive room. The man on the tape finished writing, closed the notebook, then looked directly into the camera one last time. His lips moved. There was no audio. But Daniel knew exactly what he'd said. Don't keep watching. The tape ended. Static returned. The room was silent. Daniel never watched the tape again. The following morning, he handed it to his supervisor along with his resignation. He tried to explain everything. The cameras, the journal, the observation room, the recording. His supervisor listened patiently, then placed the tape into another player, They watched it together. This time, there was nothing, just static, from beginning to end. The supervisor smiled politely and suggested Daniel take a few days off. The observation room was searched later that afternoon. By then, it had disappeared. The wall at the end of the hallway was solid concrete. There was no doorway, no room, no desk, no monitors, no VHS player, and no sign that it had ever existed. 3 weeks later, the Meridian building was demolished. Daniel watched from across the street as the final wall collapsed into a cloud of dust. He told himself it was over, that whatever had happened inside that building had been buried with it. But even now, years later, he still avoids looking at security cameras. If he walks into a supermarket, he looks away from the monitors. If he enters a shopping center, he keeps his head down, because sometimes, just for a split second, he catches himself wondering, what if the camera isn't showing me where I am? What if it's showing me somewhere I haven't been yet? I still don't know who was walking through that building that night, and after everything I saw, I'm not sure I ever want to know. You've been listening to Coal After Dark. If you enjoyed tonight's story and you'd like to hear more slow burn horror, unsettling mysteries and anonymous encounters designed for the quiet hours of the night, consider subscribing. Until next time, check the locks, turn off the lights, and if you ever find yourself somewhere that feels slightly wrong, trust your instincts, sleep well.